Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Orthopod. Today we have 4 guests with us today who are particularly invested in understanding this issue of what we're calling an infodemic. The WHO has talked profoundly about this issue and concerns around how information is being transferred and relayed in a time of a crisis, and we certainly are in one of those. We have today Sepper Ektieri, Aaron Gazendam, Aaron Wong, all from the Division of Orthopedic Surgery at McMaster University in Canada. And also have Lee Naji, who is a hospitalist in the Department of Family Medicine, also here at McMaster University. I'd like to welcome you all.
Thanks, Mo. Good to be here.
Oh, great. Nice to have you here, Sepper, and team. So why don't we proceed right in with the nature of your topic? I think I'll let you go ahead and start. I know that you have a specific area of research, and I was involved in it, so I'll let you take the lead here and maybe walk us through, if you could, your key findings.
Sure. So I'll start with a little bit of a background. Prior to the WHO actually declaring a pandemic, about a month before they declared an infodemic, and they described this as an overabundance of information, and this information having varying levels of accuracy. And much of this was related to the mainstream news as well as social media. But a lot of these sources of opinions and sources of misinformation actually had some origins within scientific articles that have been published or preprint articles. A couple of examples that have been widely spread. One was the bioengineering. There was a conspiracy that this virus was man-made, and that came from a preprint article that compared the viral characteristics to HIV. And then the second issue that's continuing to be widespread is the focus on hydroxychloroquine, especially with our partners to the south. They've poured quite a bit of money into this, and all of that has stemmed from an article that had a number of methodological flaws. So what we wanted to do is quantify and characterize all of the scientific literature that's been published on the COVID-19 virus to just be able to better understand the type of information that was being produced, as well as the speed at which it was being made available to the community.
And one thing I just jump in, Aaron, and just make a point in saying that, when information gets put out early, as we're seeing it, based on small studies or non-controlled studies, or maybe what we might consider to be low fidelity information, they could be right, but we're not sure. And I guess the issues with the antimalarials in these trials has been, they could be right, but we don't know. And I think to adopt something that has some really serious side effects without really understanding that is probably the bigger issue for some of the epidemiologists and the researchers who are a bit more cautious about adopting rapidly technologies that haven't been proven. And I just wanted to raise that out there, that information early on in an epidemic is critically important. It's just that how we use that information and when we decide to use it, I think, is also part of that problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some people have said, well, what's the harm? We know just the example of hydroxychloroquine, we know about it. It's a fairly safe drug. Well, I mean, there's always unintended consequences and unintended harms to touting something that doesn't have any benefits. One that comes to mind is just the amount of resources that are being put into it, where they could be putting those resources elsewhere.
So as Aaron mentioned, we wanted to help capture all the data out there on the COVID pandemic. So we searched PubMed systematically between December 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2020. And we looked at any study that included the terms COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, coronavirus, or any other synonym that we can think of that refers to the virus. Our search yielded over 3,000 studies, and after we went through the studies, we found that over 1,700 were actually relevant to the subject matter at hand. And then we had 6 reviewers independently extract information from those studies that we thought would be helpful in assessing the quality and the type of studies that are being published. So specifically, we wanted to see what journal these studies were being published in, the date that they were submitted for publication, as well as the date that they were actually published, because we were interested in understanding that turnaround time. We also wanted to know what the type of studies actually was. So were they case series, cohorts, RCTs, commentaries or reviews, as well as the general theme of the study. So we wanted to know if the majority of studies being published were looking at diagnostic tools, therapeutic interventions, resource allocation, or maybe even just studying the virus itself.
So let me ask you this, Lean. I mean, like, this is now a couple of weeks since this review was finished in terms of like the search date. In 2 weeks, what would be your estimate to the number of new articles that would have been added in that period? I know that, you know, it seemed like it was occurring on a daily basis. Do you think it's ramped up from the estimates that you were getting? And what would be your best guess right now in terms of how many more articles we'd likely find if we did that search accurately today?
Yeah, so if you stay tuned for our findings, you'll see that it's actually increasing exponentially. And so I would expect that we have at least several hundred new studies since that was, since our review ended.
Wow, okay, thank you.
Yeah, and so the last thing we did was also divide the studies that we found from the high impact journals compared to the low impact journals, because we wanted to see whether these characteristics differed between the high impact and lower impact journals.
Okay, so looking at some of the demographics of the articles that were included, so out of the 1,741 articles, about 43% of these articles came from China, and then next was the United States with about 10%, and then following that was the United Kingdom. So in total, about 59 countries had published articles about COVID-19, and within these, about 447 journals published articles, with the most being the British Medical Journal. 7% of these articles actually came from the BMJ, then was the Lancet, and then following that was the Journal of Medical Virology.
So, Aaron, let me ask you this. I mean, when you look at all these countries that have been producing, and was it a surprise to you that China and the United States and the UK were the ones producing the majority of the papers? Was that at all something that you hadn't already predicted based on kind of the way the virus had spread from country to country?
I think it definitely made sense given where the virus had started and how much more time in advance China had to kind of start publishing and start collecting data. So I think given that proportion, it does make a lot of sense based off of the spread of the virus itself.
Sure.
So getting into some of our really interesting findings, I thought this figure was fascinating because I'm sure everyone's seen that really great figure about flattening the curve. It was going around early on, and this kind of, reminded me of that and kind of mirrored that. And so just to orient you on the y-axis there is cumulative publications over time, and on the x-axis is the date. Like Aaron mentioned, we searched up to April 1st, and so that goes basically from January to the beginning of April there. And we split the papers up, as Lean mentioned, into things that we term primary research, meaning clinical studies, but as well as those using basic science, bench work, or using actual clinical data to perform modeling. So we're using primary data versus studies that were either reviews or commentaries, and those are in the blue, whereas the primary studies are in red. And you can see as time goes by, the primary studies are growing steadily, whereas the non-primary studies or the reviews and the commentaries seem to be growing exponentially. And we actually overlaid the global number of COVID cases in that black line there, and you can see really the number of publications over time mirrors the cumulative number of cases over time. And we actually hit 1 million cases on April 2nd there, as you can see in the top right corner.
So, Sepper, one thing that it seems that way, I don't know if we have a statistic for it, but it seems that way that the minute the pandemic was declared, there seemed to be, if anything, a ramp up of publications, as I think both you and Lean have mentioned. But the other thing that seems apparent is that the ratio of reviews and commentaries relative to scientific papers that were data oriented also seemed to increase, almost as though the minute the world called something a pandemic, opinions, expert opinions, I'm sure, became rampantly published around what seems like it's the 447 journals. Would that be your assessment?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And we did look numerically at the ratio between these two types of studies over this time period. And like you mentioned, the ratio was actually moving towards more of the reviews and commentaries towards the end of that timeline. That difference was not significant, but I think that's probably because the earlier time periods just had so few papers, and that was the main reason. But the trend was definitely towards, as you can see visually, was towards more and more of the reviews and commentaries in terms of relative terms.
Right.
So the next thing we did was look at some of the journals that I'm sure we're all familiar with, but some of the most well-respected and impactful journals. So these were actually the top 5 journals included in our search that had published more than one article each. And it's New England Journal, JAMA, Science, Lancet, and Nature in order there from left to right. And on the left side, we have a proportion of their studies which were primary studies or reviews and commentaries like we've defined before. So the primary studies, again, are in red, reviews and commentaries are in blue, and this is for each journal a proportion of their total publications. And as you can see, there's quite a range among these 5 journals. I'll just point out that when we did test this statistically, the New England Journal of Medicine did have a significantly higher proportion of primary studies than the other group of journals included in this figure here.
Do you think that this has something to do with just the general makeup of the way the journal is structured? For example, in looking at a typical table of contents, there are, journals like the British Medical Journal, which isn't on this particular list right now, but that, make it a point to be talking about commentaries and have, pretty robust commentary sections. Is it a possibility that just the makeup of the way the journals are set up routinely has already positioned them in a certain way?
Definitely, and I think along those same kind of lines is the journal's target audience. So Nature has a much more interdisciplinary target audience, and like you said, they have some of those perspective and commentary sections specifically dedicated to those kinds of things. And so I think that's definitely important to consider, and probably likely plays a part in what we're seeing here. So the next thing we did was actually group all of those high impact journals together. Again, high impact in this case being impact factor over 40. So on the right, those are the 5 journals we just talked about, and on the left is every other journal of that 400 plus journals that we'd included in total, to see if there was a difference between these 2 groups of journals. And interestingly, again, the graph set the same way, proportion on the left, impact factor on the bottom. And interestingly, the journals that had impact factors less than 40 actually had a significantly higher proportion of studies that were primary studies compared to those that had an impact factor of over 40. So those are our main findings. The other interesting thing that we found was that as the pandemic went on and the number of publications increased over time, the time to publication actually increased as well, which kind of makes sense. Yeah. Initially, there's not many submissions coming in, and so they're probably getting processed more quickly, and it probably feels more urgent. Whereas later on, they're probably taking a bit more time, and there's just more volume.
Yeah, I think the latter is true. And in interactions with editors at some of these journals, like New England and Lancet, for example, and certainly the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, which is where this particular paper has been fast-tracked and I believe is accepted for publication and should be out soon. They were saying somewhere in the ballpark, at least in the medical journals, that they're receiving about 1,000 new submissions a week related to COVID. So wow. You can imagine the triaging that needs to get done in that situation. And quite frankly, the more and more information is coming out, and more opinions, I think, are certainly being warranted. But let me ask you this: so, what do you make of this broadly? I mean, so we have the paper that says this, it shows this increase. It's an interesting, very interesting finding. But what, if anything, can we be doing about this?
I think the main takeaway from it is just recognizing that that potentially scientific journals as a whole and the scientific community as a whole may actually be part of the infodemic problem. It's not just social media, but also recognizing that the way to address it is to have these top journals and all journals be discriminant in what they're accepting, and making sure that it's framed and that it's clearly labeled in terms of things being commentaries or and perhaps with the caveats that need to go with that. And I think the same thing goes with preprint publications. They're a very valuable source of information early in something like this, but there's always a caveat that they have not undergone peer review yet. So just making sure that those things are clear to anyone who's reading them, because that information can end up in the general public who may not understand those caveats.
Okay, but let me take another a viewpoint that might be a little contrary to what you've just said. So, for example, we have an infodemic, that first wave, and we think the majority of that first wave, based on this, could in fact be commentary based. Now, there may be many journals that say, yeah, but our commentaries are actually quite valuable. In fact, have been critically important in informing what's happening. In fact, the top 5 medical journals could argue, well, we're putting up more commentaries because we have connections with really, really thoughtful leaders who have insights that, in fact, are really valuable. You should trust us over maybe the journals that aren't in that category. So certainly, I guess one of the questions that comes up might be, well, how do we know which recommendation and which commentary should be believed, if there is a checklist as such, or what would be some of the features of a commentary that you'd say, this one I would put more weight in? Because certainly there are going to be some opinions that are going to have greater weight than others. I wonder if you have any general thoughts around that. I'll take this out maybe to Lean or Aaron or Aaron.
I think anecdotally, having gone through a number of these articles and reading these commentaries, is they come in 2 flavors. There's some that are very much lack substance and aren't based on any actual data or information. And then there are some commentaries that actually look at and are more reviews and actually look at what has actually been published and actually real patient data or past experiences from previous pandemics. And I think that's the important discerning piece when we are looking at these commentaries, is that some seem to really don't have a lot of substance to them, and then others actually rely on data.
Okay, so let me ask you this, just pointed question, Lee. When you look at a commentary, or you read something that's been done, there's been no shortage of that stuff out. What are the kind of things that make you feel this is more trustworthy, or I believe this, just generally, at a first glance, compared to something else that you'd say, oh, I'm not gonna take this quite as seriously?
I think definitely when they include more patient data, as Aaron was saying. So a lot of these commentaries will talk about their experiences in treating patients with COVID. And I find that, especially like as a clinician who's dealing with patients with COVID, I find that to be the most helpful, because I can know, is this something that's relevant to my patients? I think that definitely there is a ton of data out there and it's hard to go through it all, but we also need that much research because we're treating these patients and we have no evidence to base any of it on. And so it's just such a hard balance between producing quality research, but also just producing research for people to be able to refer to it. And so in my opinion, the more patient data I have, the more I can say, does this relate to my patient? And I just treat it as a case study.
That's interesting. So now I'm asking you this one, Aaron Wong, specifically, is you're transitioning from medical school into an orthopedic training program. And certainly, as a student, you're probably going to have some biases that, the source of the insight is really important to me. So could it just be that the top 5 medical journals, being respected high impact journals, in fact, are producing very high quality commentaries? And quite frankly, if you're going to believe anything, you should believe them? Or would you still look at those with the same critical eye that you would look at a journal from a different source that may not be the same impact? And again, to your point, what would be the kind of things that would make you feel more comfortable with at least considering some of the comments?
Yeah, I think definitely my viewpoint probably initially would have been to take into account the journal that it's published in. So I think very early on, before I started looking at this data, I would definitely probably have looked at the Lancet or British Medical Journal, et cetera. I think having gone through some of our articles and looked at what is actually published in these journals, I think I've started to, you know, feel like I need to take a second look at these articles, look at who's writing them, whether they are taking care of patients with COVID or not, and sometimes even looking at how long how long the journal took to peer review the paper and actually publish it. I think those were kind of things that I started to take into account just to make sure that I'm getting more trustworthy information.
Okay, so I mean, what I'm hearing from you is that you want someone who you feel that is recognizably in the, I wouldn't say front lines, but has real insight around the problem, isn't just looking at it from, far away. That'd be one point. I think the journal itself could have some reputation because the journal itself would presumably have a peer review process. And what I'm hearing also is that, well, if they've taken some time to review it, that means there have been many more viewpoints on it, right? And so that may have been a way to shape that that product. And I think for most of us, we'd agree the peer review process, for the most part, does help a lot, and gives us insights that we may not have as authors. So I think that would be particularly important. And then I guess, does that individual or individuals also present some sort of, beyond my opinion, rationale or defense of that, and ideally defense with either a reference or some other place that you could look at where there would be data that they'd be looking at, would be at least some general factors that someone looking at the list of reviews and recommendations and commentaries could at least look at as a broad spectrum. Is there anything I've missed on that you would also want to share with audiences? Because I mean, the reality is that more likely they're going to be looking at commentaries and recommendations more than they're looking at primary research. So any guides you can provide based on your extensive experience having looked at all of these would be really helpful.
I think the one other thing that I kind of use as a litmus test is within 10 seconds, if you can't figure out the point of the commentary, then it's probably of not much benefit to you. I've seen so many of these that are basically just repeating another commentary. So they're just like a general vague overview of the, very brief epidemiology and then the viral characteristics and then that's it. So when you can't actually get the idea or the point of the article in the first few seconds of being able to read it, I don't really know if it's worth much.
Okay, so knowing what you know and going forward, how do you feel about the overall approach? I think you used the word, Sepper, trying to flatten the infodemic curve. Well, how would one do that? Like, what would be the thinking around? Well, how are we going to get to a point in the next crisis? I mean, we're still in one, but like when there's other big information cycles, what can we do from the readership side or also from the publishing side to limit the effects of this early wave of misinformation?
So I think a couple of things that will probably help going forward is having experienced this. Probably many things like expedited REB are very important, and the infrastructures for that will likely, if they're not already in place, will likely have been refined through this process. And so having the ability to start up clinical studies more quickly than we normally are in a time when they're needed more quickly is I think very important to help achieve that. Part of it, like I said earlier, is a matter of journal stewardship, and for the journals to ensure that they are providing things that are of value, whether they're commentaries or reviews or clinical data or basic science, but ensuring that it's things that are adding value to the field. And I think it's overall, actually, even though we're seeing so many articles, I think it's actually encouraging that globally, we can come together in 59 different countries and start to get science out this quickly. And so I think that's an encouraging thing. It's like you said, it's just important to make sure that it's good science and that it's helping patient care.
Very good. Anyone have any other insights or thoughts?
I guess the only thing I'll say is I think that now more than ever, it's important to have more reviews and systematic reviews. I think the challenging thing is that similar to when we did our review, by the time we start analyzing the data, there is tons more research. And so having dedicated groups to just reviewing the data maybe weekly and helping to disseminate that would be very helpful for us.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think what we should be doing is having central repositories of, of all data. And I think there's many groups that have opened up, data banks for, scientists to analyze. But there's so many examples. And one example we're seeing really is the challenging of people trying to predict the curve, right, in various countries. And there's multiple models, multiple different groups, some at cross purposes, so it becomes very, very confusing for a consumer of this information to sort it out. But yeah, those are the grand goals, I think. On that note, I want to thank you all for taking time to present this really, really impressive work. It's a ton of effort that went in. And I think it enlightens us a lot to the issue. Now, we may not have all the solutions, but at least we should be aware of the circumstances. And I think you provide some really salient advice around, well, here's the kind of things we might look for in the believability of the type of data we're looking at. So thank you all.
Thanks, Mo.
Thank you.
Thank you.